Hi again, I hope you enjoyed my last video in which I painted up a resin pulse rifle kit. That's now on display in my back bedroom and I'm hoping to use that as a display piece at future conventions with one of the costuming groups I'm in. Now for this video I'm going to be working on another Colonial marine weapon. This is a 3D printed flamethrower kit which I purchased from Chef's Creations here in the UK. Links to which are on the screen and in the description bar below. Now if you're willing to pay a bit extra, they do offer a painting and finishing service, but I went for the kit form as I fancied having a crack at this myself. So, first step, gluing all this together. Assembling the main body wasn't as straightforward as I thought it would be, as it had been printed out in several sections, which had to be matched up, and the kit doesn't come with instructions. But there are several markings on the back of each piece, which does help, so it wasn't too difficult to put together. I assembled the main body using super glue, left each section about 10 minutes or so to cure before adding the next bit. It did take a little bit of time to stick everything together, but I got there in the end. The fuel canisters came with a piece of aluminium tubing for the main body, so I scuffed up the ends with some sandpaper to give the adhesive something to bond to, and glued the end pieces in place using epoxy resin. Well, that's the main body glued together. Now, the next thing I want to do before I start filling and sanding is to attach a couple of sling mounting points to the front and rear, like the ones in the film had. Now, this kit doesn't come supplied with those, so what I'm going to do is, I've got a strip of exhaust bracket here, and I'm going to try and adapt that. I had to drill out the hole slightly, as the clips for the sling were a bit on the wide side. I then used a Dremel to cut them to shape, and sand off any rough bits. It was then just a case of cutting and drilling a couple of slots in the main body. And finally, these were glued into place using epoxy resin. Well, that's the sling mounts taken care of. Now the next thing is to attach the gas canister here. Now I could just glue this to the underside. However, I want to be able to detach this to make it easy to transport when I'm going to conventions. So, got myself a bit of studded bar and a nut here, and the plan is glue this into the top of the canister and then sink the nut into the base of the flamethrower here, and then they should just screw together. To sink the nut into the underside, it was just a case of marking out where the canister should go and then using an appropriate sized hole cutter. The nut was then fixed into place using resin. Similarly, with the canister, I just drilled a 12mm hole into the centre of the opening and then epoxy resin the threaded bar into place. And there we have it. One detachable fuel canister. Okay, now for the tricky part, assembling the grip and the trigger. Again, this was just stuck together using super glue. Now in order to make the trigger functional, I decided to hinge it using the centre pin from a plastic car body trim clip which I got from Halfords, which after some careful drilling worked very nicely. To make it spring loaded, I drilled a hole in the back of the trigger and glued a compression spring into it. Then to give it something to sit over, glued a rivet into the inside of the handle. Before gluing the handle on, I decided to do something about the unsightly join lines first. For the most part I just used ordinary model filler because it was easy to work with. This is fine for seams, but for larger gaps I'd recommend car body filler as it's a bit more durable and it dries quicker, although it does require a bit more sanding. Once everything was filled, it was then on to sanding with some medium grit paper, just to smooth over the filler and take off the worst of the printing lines. Then the trigger handle was finally glued into place. Okay, the next step, I'm just going to give this a quick coat of primer, as this will highlight all the imperfections and show me where I need to do a bit more filling and sanding. For this, I just used ordinary grey car primer which I got from Halfords. I used several light coats, giving each one about 15 minutes to dry before spraying on the next. Then after I'd finished with the main body, I turned my attention to the gas canister, which was given a thorough sanding before it too received a good coat of primer. Well, that's the base coat finished. I've given it a light rub down with some 1200 grit wet and dry paper and cleaned that off. I'm now going to give it a coat of high build primer, as this should just smooth over any of the printing lines that still exist. Once sanded down, it should give us a nice neat finish. As with the regular primer, I gave this several light coats. Then once dry, was given a good sanding with some wet and dry paper. A couple of areas had very sharp print lines which were difficult to sand smooth, so I decided to go over these with car body filler and then give them another good sanding before giving the whole thing one last good coat of high build primer. Well, that's all the prep work done, so now I'm going to start spraying on the base coat. Now, the flamethrowers in the film were painted brown best, the same as the pulse rifle shrouds, which, as I said in my last video, was a colour made by Humble Model Paints, which is no longer made, unfortunately. However, Owlclad do a British brown best, which is identical to it, so I'm going to be using that here. Before spraying, I gave everything a quick wipe over with a tack rag, just to remove any dust. Then I fired up the old airbrush and proceeded to spray on the main colour coat. Owlclad paints are airbrush ready, so don't require any thinning, which was nice. Though it did take several coats to adequately cover over all the yellow. Whilst the main body painted, so now it's time to add the black detailing. Now you'll notice that the areas that I'm about to paint have suddenly turned grey. Well, that's because I decided to give these a quick coat of grey primer first, just to dull down the garish yellow of the high build paint, which is really what I should have done with the main body, as then I wouldn't have needed so many coats of brown to build the colour up. But anyway, I'm going to be spraying the satin black, as I think that'll look better on this, so I'm just going to mask this up and then I'm going to get to work. I decided to use a rattle can for this rather than the airbrush. This was actually the easiest part to do and had these areas painted up in no time. Then finally, the vent holes were sprayed, which involved some rather tricky masking. These were sprayed matte black. Whilst the painting finished, I've decided against weathering it at the moment, as it's taken me long enough to get to this stage, so that's something I might pop back and do at a later time. Now, just for the moment, before I bottle this together, is I just want to spray a coat of clear lacquer over everything, just to protect the paintwork, so that's what I'm going to do next. The lacquer was just ordinary hobby spray, which again was applied using a rattle can. Though this looks shiny because it's wet, this was actually a matte finish, and will dull down once it's dried. Well, now that's all finished, there's only one thing left to do, and that's bolt all this together again. Starting with the tricky part, attaching the trigger. Now the centre pin from these car trim clips, which I'm using to hinge the trigger, has this raised underside, so they don't fit square against the flamethrower body. I got around this by making a little recess either side of the hole using my Dremel, so that they would fit flush. Now this is something that I really should have sorted out before I painted it, but what's done is done. The trigger was then slotted into place with the spring seated over the rivet that I'd glued inside. Then the pin was just pushed into place to hinge it. These were just the right length to go through the handle but not protrude out the other side, so I just snipped off the spindle from another one of these and glued the end button over the hole to neaten things up. Then finally, it was just a case of screwing the fuel canister back into place and attaching a sling which I'd also purchased. And there we have it. One Colonial Marine Flamethrower painted and finished and ready for my next convention. Now, I'm really happy with how this has turned out. I might go back at a later date and put a bit of weathering on here, but it's taken me long enough to get to this stage, so I think this will do for now. Now, if you fancy one of these, like I say, you can pick them up from Chef's Creations, links to which will be in the channel bar below. But anyway, that's about it for now, so I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.